www.iq.com.
Hi, I'm Jenn White, and this is the 1A podcast. What does it mean when an entire species is gone for good? The Fish and Wildlife Service declared 22 animals and one plant extinct last week. This is one of the largest extinction announcements ever made by the agency, which could be part of the reason it's gotten so much attention. But declaring extinction isn't as straightforward as you might think. Many of the species on the list likely disappeared decades ago, and knowing for sure can be difficult. And climate change is only exacerbating the problem of extinction. A report released by the United Nations last year estimates that 1 million plant and animal species are at risk of being gone for good. Here with us to talk about it is Bridget Fahey. She's the Division Chief of Ecological Services for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Bridget, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me, Jen.
So what were some of the species declared extinct by your agency?
The species, there were a variety of species, but approximately half of them were species that occur on islands. And island species are at heightened risk of extinction due to their limited ranges and their isolation. Another large chunk of the species were freshwater mussels from the southeastern United States. And the southeastern United States is a hot spot for freshwater mussels. And many of these species of mussel went extinct as a result of dam construction in the early 1900s.
Now, there was also one plant on that list. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the plant. The plant has not been getting a lot of love through the press attention, probably because people are challenged to pronounce it. It's the Phylogenetic, and it's a flowering plant from Hawaii. We know very little about this plant. It's known from only a few collections over time, and like so many species out there, we missed the opportunity to learn more about it with its extinction.
So what does it actually mean for species to be declared extinct?
Well, there's a permanence and finality to it. It means that that species is gone from the planet and is never going to be seen again. So it's a loss. It's a loss for our country, and it's a loss for global biodiversity as well.
Now, as I said, many of these 23 species have likely been extinct for decades. Why is there a delay between the actual disappearance of the species and when the Fish and Wildlife Service makes that declaration?
Well, due to the finality of it, we want to be super sure that we're taking the right action. And so we wait for some amount of time to make sure we look for the species and try to recover it in the wild. It's not a decision that we take lightly. So we want to make sure that the species is truly extinct.
Well, and just walk us through the process of declaring extinction. What all has to happen to reach that declaration point?
Our scientists make an assessment of the best available information. And so they'll look at when's the last time that we saw the species? How easy or difficult is it to detect that species in the wild? What's been the survey effort over time? Have we had a lot of people looking for it or not so much? And when we look at all that information, the scientists will make a recommendation. But I want to make sure everyone knows that this is not a final decision yet. The publication of the proposed rule last week opened a 60-day public comment period, and we'll be taking public comments through the end of November. After that, we will assess any new scientific information submitted and received, and we will expect to make final decisions on each of these species in about a year.
And when we talk about that public comment period, who are you expecting to comment? Is this the opportunity for other scientists to come forward with information? Is it just for the public to say, hey, I saw this animal in my backyard, I don't think it's extinct?
We are looking for science, although the public is willing to comment and take their views, but we only really assess substantial scientific information. And so if we get credible reports that the species might have been discovered somewhere, we will follow up on those.
Now, one of the species declared extinct last week was the ivory-billed woodpecker. That was a recording from 1935, which is the last documented sighting of the bird. But some bird watchers have sworn the woodpecker has been sighted as recently as 2005. And as we've seen with the ivory-billed woodpecker, the question of whether a species is actually extinct can be a source of contention. How do you know for certain that a species is gone for good? Have there been instances where a species was declared extinct and then it was spotted again?
I have heard that there are cases that a species has been rediscovered. At one point, we believed that the black-footed ferret was extinct, but then it was rediscovered, and now we have an active conservation program. It's very difficult to prove a negative. And so do we have certainty? That might be too high a bar. Our scientists are very cautious by nature. So all we're saying at this point is the best available science indicates that it is most likely extinct.
Once that extinction declaration is formalized after the public comment period, what happens then?
We continue to assess the status of species under the Endangered Species Act. We continue to work on recovery, and hopefully we work on some larger conservation efforts that go beyond the Endangered Species Act to help keep common species common and get ahead of the global biodiversity crisis.
This latest announcement from the Fish and Wildlife Service has triggered, I think, a strong response from the public. What would you urge the public to do to, support your efforts to prevent more species from going extinct?
Well, the causes of extinction, can be influenced by all of us. We can make personal choices to reduce our contributions to greenhouse gas emissions, plastics, microplastics, but probably more importantly, we can support some of the larger efforts to conserve species. There are so many people working on conservation across the globe, so many agencies, NGOs, I mentioned states, tribes as well. There are very many regional efforts as well. I'm a relative newcomer to the DC area, but I've just been so impressed by all the regional parks in this area. And so there's a lot of conservation efforts going on, and then kind of bringing them together and making sure they're working together to make a global picture that makes sense, I think, is really key.
That's Bridget Fahey. She's the Division Chief of Ecological Services for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Bridget, thanks for speaking with us.
Thank you, Jen.
Some conservationists argue that the biodiversity crisis is just as dire as the climate crisis, but it gets less attention. We'll hear from one of those conservation scientists in just a moment. I'm Jenn White. This is 1A from WAMU and NPR. Some conservationists argue that the biodiversity crisis is just as dire as the climate crisis, but it gets less attention. We'll hear from one of those conservation scientists after the break. And remember, to have your questions answered on future topics or to just let us know what you think, tweet us at 1A.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Norton LifeLock. Remember the saying, if you love something, set it free. If it doesn't come back, it was never yours. Well, when it comes to identity theft, LifeLock doesn't think so. That's why LifeLock by Norton helps monitor your info and alerts you to potential identity threats. If you do become a victim, a U.S.-based specialist will help fix it. No one can prevent all identity theft or monitor all transactions at all businesses. Save up to 25% off your first year at lifelock.com/podcast.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Wyzant, a one-to-one tutoring alternative to online classes where you can learn face-to-face online. Get help with tackling new subjects and career skills, or just catching up. Wyzant lists thousands of personal instructors in over 300 subjects, available for live, individualized lessons with their online learning platform. Head to wyzant.com to find your perfect instructor. Love it, or your first hour is free. Because at Wyzant, we take learning personally.
If you ever wonder how the world's most successful leaders got to where they are, what struggles they faced, and what kept them going, there's a show for you. Each week on my new podcast, my guests reveal how to think more like a leader. Check out Wisdom from the Top from NPR and Luminary.
Over this last year and a half, the world's been through a lot. So on this season of the StoryCorps podcast, we'll hear stories reminding us that even when times are hard, we can still begin again. Listen to our new season wherever you get your podcasts.
We're discussing the 23 species that were declared extinct by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Let's broaden the conversation to talk about what the threat of extinction means for the planet with Leah Gerber. She's a professor of conservation science at Arizona State University. She's also the founding director of the university's Center for Biodiversity Outcomes. Leah, it's great to have you.
Thank you, Jen. Happy to be here.
Also with us is Tierra Curry. She's a senior scientist at the Center for Biological Diversity. That's a nonprofit organization focused on protecting endangered species. Tierra, welcome to the program.
Thank you for covering extinction.
Well, extinction is the most extreme threat to a species, but Tierra, what are the different levels that come before we say the species is extinct?
Right. So before a species has become extinct, it has declined by so much. And that's why it's so frustrating for conservationists that it can take 12 years for a species to gain Endangered Species Act protection. Like the monarch butterfly, we petitioned for its protection back in 2014. It's not going to get a decision until 2024, and it's already declined by 85%. So we need to intervene when we see species crashing.
And is that delay because scientists are researching the status of the butterfly, or is it bureaucracy or something else?
It's bureaucracy. The eastern and western monarch populations are below their quasi-extinction threshold. The western population has crashed by 99%. So the science is clear. It's the bureaucracy and all of the political things that are involved with trying to get a species officially protected and then funded.
Well, and just to be clear, once a species is extinct, is there any chance of it ever being recovered?
Well, extinct species are occasionally rediscovered, but the sooner you could protect a species, the cheaper the recovery would be and the more possible it would be. Right now, species, it's so long before they're protected that recovery is extremely difficult and even more expensive.
Now, Leah, just because we might be seeing certain animals less doesn't necessarily mean they've gone extinct. What's the science behind tracking the extinction of a species?
Oh, well, that's a really good question. Thank you so much for having me. So let's see. I was a lead author on the UN IPBES Global Assessment of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services report that we produced a couple years ago. And that report, as you mentioned, referenced, or we concluded that approximately 1 million species are at risk of extinction on our planet. And this assessment, we concluded this based on looking at sort of what I call the statistics of evolution, of looking at phylogenetic trees and combining that with assessments that the the IUCN, International Union for the Conservation of Nature, produces that is essentially a global list of threatened and endangered animals. So with putting those numbers together, we concluded that approximately 1 million species are at risk of extinction. This has huge ramifications not only for natural systems on our planet, but also for our social and economic systems, because similar to human communities, we need that diversity to persist. Many of the services that nature provides are also at risk.
Now, you used a term there, phylogenetic tree. Just explain what that is.
Okay, so if we look at the evolution of species and in terms of the taxonomy, there are different classes and genera, and in the case of the estimate of 1 million species, we have very limited data on the actual total number of species on Earth. about the best estimate is about 1.7 million species have been given scientific names, but this number is still growing as we discover new species. We think that there are approximately, the best estimate is, even though we've only named about 1.7 million species, there's quite a bit of uncertainty. The best estimate is approximately 25 million. Of the 25 million, that the best estimate for 25 million, we can estimate that about 8 million species, there are about 8 million species on Earth. And as one of your listeners just pointed out, insects are a key part of this. So approximately 25% of species are insects.
And so that phylogenetic tree is basically, it's a diagram that helps you track the evolutionary relationships among biological species, how they're related to one another. Is that a good explanation of that?
Thank you. Probably better than mine. But the essential thing here is that we think that the extinction rate, so overall for the IUCN Red List, about 25% in total of species are at risk of extinction. Insects, it's probably a little bit lower. So I'm sort of stepping you through how we calculated this million. So about 500,000 are insects and 500,000 are plants, and the rest of the species on Earth, plants and other animals.
In your research, are extinctions caused exclusively by humans, or do they occur for other reasons?
Well, the other most recent mass extinction event was caused by an asteroid, or there's a lot of consensus that it was the asteroid. But now the choices that humans are making are driving other species off the planet. And the thing about that is we realize that we're doing it, and so we could choose a different course. Like the bramblecay melames was a small mammal in an island off Australia. And it was the first mammal to go extinct because of climate change impacts alone. It was lost because of sea level rise. And when that happened, Australian Senator Janet Rice said, extinction is a political choice. And I just clung to that statement because I think it's so true. We have the technology and the solutions to fight climate change and to end extinction, and we're not using them. We're just going on with the status quo.
Beyond extinction, what serious challenges does the changing climate pose to species that are under threat in trying to survive?
So climate change threatens to pull the rug out from under all wildlife populations and ultimately human survival. It's this existential threat is the popular term that's really come into vogue in the last couple of years. But so you've got places like the International Monarch Biosphere Reserve or Joshua Tree National Park or Glacier National Park that are protected, but climate change is going to make those places unsuitable for the very features that they're named after. So we really have to protect large swaths of land, entire ecosystems and corridors so that wildlife can move.
Mm-hmm. Leah, when you think about climate change and how it's exacerbating the problem of human-caused extinction, from a policy perspective, what would be some of the more immediate changes that we could make to try to address the issue?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that I like to say in the context of the extinction crisis that we're facing globally and also in the U.S. is that the Endangered Species Act is not broken, it's starving. And what we need is investment in the actions that are deemed necessary for recovering these endangered species. So the news last week focused on the species that were delisted due to extinction. But what I think is important to recognize is that for the most part, the Endangered Species Act works. For the 1,666 other species that are listed, we've had very few extinctions. And so I think the fact that we are currently not adequately funding the Endangered Species Act. An earlier estimate from some of my work in 2016 estimated that only about 25% of the $1.2 billion that is needed for implementing recovery actions is actually allocated to recovery. And so I think that we can, even in the face of climate change, the best thing we can do is to support the actions that are needed for recovery. If this is a national priority, then we should be allocating these resources.
We're discussing extinction and the consequences associated with losing a species. A reminder that you can join future conversations. Download our 1A Vox Pop app and leave us a voicemail. We'll be back with more after the break.
This message comes from NPR sponsor BASF. North American Chairman and CEO Michael Hines shares why they're taking on the challenge of improving the batteries in electric cars.
We are one of the major suppliers of the main ingredients that you would find in a car manufacturer's battery. And as the automotive industry is shifting more towards electromobility, we also have a responsibility through science to come up with some of these solutions.
To learn more about BASF's battery material innovations, go to BASF.com.
How do we reinvent ourselves? And what's the secret to living longer? I'm Anoush Zamarodi. Each week on NPR's TED Radio Hour, we go on a journey with TED speakers to seek a deeper understanding of the world and to figure out new ways to think and create. Listen now.
Over this last year and a half, the world's been through a lot. So on this season of the StoryCorps podcast, we'll hear stories reminding us that even when times are hard, we can still begin again. Listen to our new season wherever you get your podcasts.
Let's get back to our conversation about species extinction. Now, Leah, recovery is what many conservationists are working towards. What does recovery mean, and what do those efforts look like?
Recovery under the Endangered Species Act, in its language, is recovered to a point where it's no longer in danger of extinction. In terms of actual implementation, we think about recovery as species being a functional component of its particular ecosystem. The Endangered Species Act doesn't define quantitative criteria for defining recovery. So we in the scientific community work to estimate, for particular species, what this means in terms of a functioning ecosystem, which, as you may imagine, is quite nuanced. As I mentioned earlier, the IUCN Red List actually defines quantitative criteria for determining categorization under different levels of risk. For example, endangered, critically endangered, and threatened under the IUCN. However, in the US, we don't have such quantitative criteria, so it's up to agency biologists to establish, based on extensive reviews of the best available scientific evidence, what merits a change in status under the Endangered Species Act. And for the most part, as I mentioned, the Endangered Species Act has been quite effective, and we've actually had much more, positive outcomes in terms of recovery. Many species have been recovered, and many species have moved from the threatened to from the endangered to threatened category. So downlisted in terms of their recovery.
We got this tweet from Kimberly who says, orcas are in danger of extinction because of warming oceans. The king salmon they eat are endangered. All species matter, from microorganisms to humans, and we are all in trouble. And Brandon writes this: the Endangered Species Act is not effective. We need to expand natural protected areas and reintroduce native ensnared species. Instead, we spend a lot of time in legal fees, slowing down federal funded aid projects, even as hundreds of acres of land are destroyed for private development. Leah, we've mentioned the Endangered Species Act a couple of times, but first, just explain a little bit more about what the act actually does.
Oh, that is a really good question. So the Endangered Species Act, I would argue, is our nation's most powerful piece of legislation to protect endangered species. Indeed, there is quite a bit of controversy about its relative efficacy, given the extinction crisis that we're facing. I would argue that the Endangered Species Act itself is effective. It's that we are not funding the actions that are required to actually implement the act. So in addition to the federal agencies that are responsible for protection of endangered species, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service, the Act does also require, under Section 7, a consultation for any federal action that may impact the continued existence of any species. I do think that under the Biden administration's America is Beautiful aspirations of protecting 30% of nature by the year 2030, there's a lot of wonderful potential for improving the efficacy of the Endangered Species Act. So in addition to funding, I think what's on the horizon and that I'm particularly optimistic about is a national biodiversity strategy. And this would allow, bring biodiversity to a higher level of priority, national priority, by establishing a comprehensive federal response to the crisis. So what I think we need is this, in addition, or in lieu of sort of this sporadic, different agencies responsible for different parts of implementing the act. In terms of tackling the biodiversity crisis, what we need is a coordinated all-of-government approach to confront this problem so that we can actually avoid more extinctions.
Now, Tierra, you've argued that the biodiversity crisis is just as big of a crisis as the climate one, even though it gets much less attention. Is it possible at this point, though, to really separate the two crises, or are they integrated in a way that makes them something we have to deal with as one?
We should definitely deal with them as one. We need to fight for justice, fight climate change, and protect biodiversity all at the same time with all of the considerations on the table so that, like, if we're mining for a mineral to allegedly make climate change better, we need to not wipe out an endemic plant that lives just there. We absolutely have to fight all of them together. And I'd like to comment, too, on the Endangered Species Act not working. The critics that say that are usually the people who are going to lose money because they want to develop the last habitat of a species or poison a river. And so let's just up the ante and give nature rights. Let's give rivers rights. Instead of the fish that lives in the river, give the whole river a right. And then you can't dump poison in it or drain it or other things. Like, we're committing ecocide, and we have to draw the line somewhere and say enough is enough.
I'm curious about what's also happening on the global stage, because this isn't an issue that's limited to the U.S.
Right. The United States, though, we're uniquely positioned to show leadership on this issue and to help fund biodiversity protection around the globe, like wildlife trade. People think it doesn't happen here, but we're responsible for 25% of wildlife trade. Like, I could go online right now and buy a bat paperweight, and that just has to change.
And globally, what are the discussions happening around protecting species?
Well, there's the Half Earth initiative that we should protect half of Earth as wildlife habitat by 2050 as a matter of survival. And there's global biodiversity talks right now to talk about things like wildlife trade and is it even possible to have healthy wildlife trade and how to fund these things internationally.
We got this tweet from Barb who says, it's hard to get people to care about animals and plants they don't know about, but until they hear that there are no more animals and plants that they do know, then they will care when it's too late. Leah, and just, extinction is happening, but it's extreme, and it also gets the most attention in public conversations. But what would you urge us to focus on right now?
Well, I think that, as you say, extinction is forever. Once something is extinct, they can't come back. And somehow the biodiversity crisis has become politicized, and I'm hopeful that this can become a bipartisan issue. We all care about life on Earth. We all depend on it. And I'm hopeful that we can really get together as a nation and establish a national biodiversity strategy and properly fund the ESA to curb this tragedy.
That's Leah Gerber, a professor of conservation science at Arizona State University. She's also the founding director of the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes at the university. Also with us, Tierra Curry. She's a senior scientist at the Center for Biological Diversity, a nonprofit organization focused on protecting endangered species. Thanks to you both. Today's producer was Haley Blassingame. Our podcast is produced by Barb Anguiano. This program comes to you from WAMU, part of American University in Washington, distributed by NPR. I'm Jenn White. Thanks for listening. This is 1A.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Spectrum Business. To help small business owners cut their internet and phone costs, Spectrum Business has created a new savings calculator. Go to spectrum.com/business calculator, and you can see how much you'll save by switching to Spectrum Business. Restrictions apply.